Hey everyone, welcome back to an exciting episode of In the Chute. I'm Brandon, he's Calen, and he's going to give me some subject that I know nothing about, well, ahead of time, but hopefully I know something about because he asked a question, but I may know nothing about that as well. Anyway, Calen, what do you got for us?
Yeah, so a couple of weeks ago, we talked to Moses Woodson from the High Desert Homestead. I
Yep,
always want to say High Plains, but it's High Desert
I
Homestead.
doesn't.
If you guys want, go ahead and look at one of our Hangouts episodes. Check him out at his YouTube page and everything. But something I want to talk about because it's more, it's better for maybe a shoot episode is some of the takeaways from that conversation, because on here I've got some of the things that I learned from him and I thought would be really good for us to discuss, and I'll just lay them out real quick so we can kind of go through them, which is some bad practices from the east that he kind of explained about in Tennessee and the Kentucky area, which I'm currently residing in Kentucky, but I don't get to do much of the farming here. I'm doing the army life. It's totally different.
Right.
But some of the things that he explained, the compassion aspect comes more from the lifestyle, because he explained, living in the city and stuff, you don't have compassion because, everybody just focuses on themselves. And then you're out here and we'll do an episode eventually, a longer episode, but you kind of help your neighbors out and stuff. Also the requirement to have an outside income. We've discussed that before. You got to have that outside job to kind of help support. Behind every successful farmer or rancher is that wife in town is the thing that we like to say. Then saving scraps, it's kind of an inconvenient lifestyle because of that, and you're always just trying to make the most out of what you've got. And then finally, the big takeaway with that was the Homestead Act allowed for stakes of 100 acres at a time, or 160 acres at a time.
Right.
I'm sorry. And it makes a whole lot more sense. We've already talked about, the Ohio Valley and being able to sustain a family and a homestead on 160 acres before. Got it. Understand. But when he explains how homesteading is more self-sufficient and not producing for others, which is what ranching is, and we asked him very specifically, when does it change from ranch or from homesteading to ranching? And his straight answer across the board, I kind of prodded him a couple of times, and looking back through it, I didn't intentionally do that, but I was trying to get a better answer for it. But really, the answer was what he told us from the beginning. And he said, when you can't sustain yourself anymore and you're producing for others, that's when it changes from a homestead to a ranch. And then, of course, I broke one of our old rules, which is never ask somebody how many acres they have. And he said he's got 10. And he said, we've got plenty of land on 10 acres to homestead to be self-sufficient. But I asked him also, what's the biggest you've seen for a homestead? He goes, well, about 200 acres. And he said they were really stretched thin, but it worked for him. But knowing that now, that 160 acres in the Homestead Act, it makes way more sense now, because when you're just looking to be self-sufficient, I thought that was really interesting, versus we look at it always from a ranching perspective of trying to maximize what you got. So we're like, hey, more acreage, more cattle, more livestock, more production. But for them, it's just, hey, it's only for me and it's for me only. If I have a little extra, I'll sell it. But those were kind of the big ones I want to talk about. And man, that 160 acres, that blew my mind when I finally realized that. It was like an epiphany. I was like, yep, it makes a whole lot more sense now.
Well, and really, I think that number was just a convenient number
Yeah. It's a quarter
to
section.
carve up,
Easy.
a section into four pieces,
Yeah.
which would give someone plenty of ground from that, from where they came from, that, middle Ohio Valley, like we've talked about, that they could give away the land. It was government land. The government owned it all after the Louisiana Purchase and just had not settled it. And they wanted to increase production, occupy it. So giving that land away in those size increments just made good sense
Right.
in the context of, hey, the soil's different, the weather's different, all of these different things that go to allow that to be a viable operation. And what it was is proving up on the land, right?
Right.
And so the size of the ground for that area, I think, had the assumption that they would contribute to a market system. It wasn't about just self-sustaining. It was about putting this land into production. And they found quickly that doing that by hand is,
It's a lot of
well,
work.
for most, it's a failure. And and especially if you're farming, this ground is more suited to grazing,
Right.
really in comparison. So yeah, that
Well, and my
it
mom's
makes
in
sense.
the ear. She's got an earbud in. She's in a different room, but she's listening to me talk. And she just said
This was a
a quick
mistake.
thing. Yeah, I was, but she said, the richness in the ground, which is what you're talking about
Mm-hmm.
between the Atlantic and Montana or the West. But it's exactly that. This is more grazing ground. I like to say west of the Mississippi, more generally speaking, but west of the Mississippi, it's grazing ground versus east, it's more cultivation. You can get a lot more from it, which again goes back to you can do a whole lot more with a whole lot less ground
Right.
and territory to get that done.
Right.
What do you think about some of those quote bad practices that he talks about in the East about being able to lose cattle and they just kind of like they slough it off? Like that just blew my mind.
Yeah. Well, it's like we don't, and maybe it's because it's a margin thing.
Yeah.
If they lose something, it's like, yeah, okay, it'll turn up or it won't, and it's just the way it is. It's like for us, every animal counts, and because apparently our margins are much tighter
Mhm.
for that, and in that kind of a context as well, where we're scraping by, and every animal makes that scratch just a little bit less deep, right? So
Yeah.
we're not putting polish on stuff. We're just trying to keep from destroying that tabletop or that doorway that we're hanging into. So yeah, that kind of really surprised me, that you would not be as concerned, because God, I've been hired to go find cattle, when I was in my early 20s, late teens. We lost these many, this is how many we got, can you go find them? And you got 6 square miles to go try to find these animals, and that might not be where they're at, because they might have kept hit a fence line and kept on going. So it's yeah, that's a whole different way of thinking. I understand the compassion part, in a way, surprised me, but we hear about how it's kind of every man for himself in a higher population areas, and and even still here, even like the biggest city in Montana is Billings. But when somebody's really down and out, I mean, a community at large who people don't even know each other pull together to help them out.
Right.
So even here, still that culturally is there, but I think it probably takes a very big event for somebody to get that kind of a following even here locally. But on a small community like we're at here, where the ranch is, people, they get into a bind. In fact, as a neighbor, it's been, I don't know how many years ago now, 12, 15 years ago, had a flash flood and lost almost his entire herd. Um, they drowned, were pushed over a rim. I mean, he's out. So everybody in the area gave him some heifers to get started again. I mean, he had, a variation of color,
Yeah.
doesn't matter, but everybody dug out of their own stuff and provided him. And I shouldn't say everybody, because I don't know who all contributed, but a good number of people did, to where he had enough animals that he had the same amount or slightly more than what he started with. That's compassion, and that's
Right.
understanding where somebody's at, and it can happen to you in a blink of an eye.
Well, and I can also see where he's coming from too, is living in the more urban lifestyle. There's a level of trust that's not there either, because if I see a car on the side and I don't normally, I go around with concealed carry, so I feel somewhat prepared for situations, but there's a lot of times where you just don't pull over because you don't know if that's somebody that's trying to, in a sense, it's like a hook. They get you to pull over and then they take advantage of you in some way, hold you at gunpoint, because that happens a lot out here. But some of those things, or just gang related activity, I don't know. I question it. So people just drive by. I totally get what he's talking about. And
Yeah.
It kind of goes against, especially when you grow up in a in a lifestyle where you do, hey, the car's pulled over, stop it, see if you can help out. Yeah, you don't do that. You just keep driving. You're like, hey, I don't care. They'll figure it out. They got self-service. You check and you're like, yep, there's plenty of bars they can call. That's kind of how you look at it.
Well, and it is, and it depends on the time of year. It depends on,
right.
Because in Montana, there is a law that if somebody is needs assistance, you must stop.
Mm-hmm.
But you're right that that a cultural difference or cultural shift takes place with criminals. That, you know, what a great way, you know, go into a culture who's a bunch of innocents, and really it's innocent about, you know, how this could affect them negatively when they're just trying to help. And dude, I don't know how many people I've stopped and helped over the
Right.
years, you know, going down a highway. But there's some times, especially if your mom's traveling along, it's like, do not stop.
Right.
You know, if it's an older, if you're looking and you got some women, some elderly people, a single woman with a bunch of kids. I mean, you assess that as you're coming up on it. And I haven't refused to help anybody yet. In
Yeah.
fact, is probably stopped in some spots where I shouldn't have. There, one time you were really little, and there was a car pulled over, and here's some guys beating on another guy, and I mean, I pulled over, and went out to stop it and did, but it was like, that was dumb. You know, that could have turned bad very, very easily.
Well,
So yeah,
and out
it's
here too, like one of the big differences, instead of pulling up behind the car, you pull up in front of the car, so you can kind of see exactly what you're talking about. You can assess, hey, what's going on in that car? Do I pull over? Okay, yeah,
yeah,
it's okay. You can pull over
yeah.
in front. But the other thing, we already talked about kind of the outside income, but I want to get your thought of, he said it's just an inconvenient life, and you got to kind of save scraps, make the most out of what you've got. What were you thinking with that? And we've got about 4 minutes left.
Yeah, no, that was there's a couple of points there very telling about, you don't throw anything away. I grew up that way. I
Yeah.
grew up with Depression era
Let's
grandparents.
say depression era. That's what like even
Yeah,
even now, I'm 100 years later, and I still
yeah,
think depression like in terms of
absolutely.
saving things. Yeah.
You know, and there's some things I get rid of, but I think about, could I use that? What could that be used for? Is there a purpose that maybe I would need to get a chunk of steel like that sometime? And if the answer is yes,
Yeah.
you know, a pretty good size stuff sticks around. Wheel drums, no, not so much, but even still, yeah, I can see where we could use that. You know,
Well, I
so
remember
there's
asking one
a lot
time,
of
you
them.
had an old, really messed up, hold on a second. Oh, my mom says hoarder, having hoarder parents. Yeah. All right. We've had that discussion as well. But no, the big thing was, we had a giant cattle guard that had been all bent up and replaced. And I even looked at you, said, do we keep that for extra stuff? And you actually said, no, let's not. We'll just scrap it. We'll get money off of it. And we'll use, okay. Yeah.
Yeah,
That's probably
yeah,
the better option.
yeah. That one was, but I mean, that's kind of a judgment call too. But there could come a time when it's like, oh God, I wish I had
We
that
could have
back.
torched it, used a chunk for
Yeah.
something. Yeah.
One of the things about, you know, having a spouse that works in town, every time behind every successful rancher farmer is a woman who works in town, right?
Yeah.
Or a wife who works in town. That's not any different when you think about it with two income households to be able to make it. Whether
Yeah.
you're, working a job at a factory, or you've got an office job and your wife has to work to make ends meet, it's the same thing. It's just a different way of going about it. It used to be that you didn't have to do that either in a city or out here. Um, but the amount of income that's steady on our part, you get paid for once a year for, whether you're raising cattle or grain, whatever it is, or, some kind of a commodity like that that's has a seasonal growing. You have one paycheck a year, where someone who works in town, they will be able to make a steady income and have a little bit coming in. And I think that's a giant difference, but it's, even still, it's not easy. I mean, people are going broke,
Yeah.
and
Well, I think your
that's
point right
something
there
different
is
from the
just,
50s to the 60s.
well, yeah, and I think that's what it is it's the, like you're saying, it's the steady part. It's the part where it's reliable. That's what I should say.
Right.
The reliable part, because that one crop a year, whether it be grain or livestock, that prices
As long as
fluctuate.
as long as the crop is successful,
Yeah.
as long as the market holds. I mean, there's lots of things there that can interfere with that. We've discussed that ad nauseum too.
Yeah. Well, those are some of our lessons from Mr. Moses Woodson from the High Desert Homestead. We really enjoyed having him join us, and we will have also a small short episode coming up soon. So be tuned in for that. With that, we'll put that conversation out to pasture.